I will now call Samuel Dhol, who is a medical doctor and a researcher on tropical and infectious diseases here in Oxford at the university at the Center for Tropical Medicine and Global Health. And Samuel is going to respond or try to respond to the question, why would free, fair and credible elections revive South Sudan?
So a lot has already been said. And of course, my topic was conceived with the fact that we are thinking about elections in South Sudan. There were talks about elections in South Sudan. And much as only one party was advocating for that, and of course, paying elections in South Sudan. And we have learned recently, that was in September, that of course the elections are no longer going to take place, but they will eventually take place, whether it's after 10 years. And I think in an event that these elections take place, they should be free, fair, and credible. So what do we understand by free, fair, and credible elections? Of course, having free, fair, and credible elections is a fundamental principle upon which many indicators of democracies are measured. You cannot say you're a democracy if you cannot hold frequent or regular elections. Lindbergh posits that a free and fair electoral process enacts an important component of distributive justice in relation to power, and this enhances authority and legitimacy of a democratically elected government. Currently in Juba, we have a government. But when was it elected? I don't remember when that government was ever elected. The only elections I remember in Sudan, that was in Southern Sudan, not South Sudan. Southern Sudan, which was a region, a semi-autonomous region in the Sudan. That was in 2010. Since then, no one has been elected. We currently have a parliament that has been bloated to contain 550 members of parliament. They are supposed to be representatives of the people. And with defined constituencies, whom are they representing? These are questions that we should be asking. And if they're not representing anyone, whom are they accountable to? Is it more to their political parties? Is it to the people of South Sudan, and which people? Hotels in Juba that we are, I'm so and so from this political party, I'm representing, for example, someone from Northern Upper Nile or Rank. And then the people from Rank do not even know you. So that makes it, difficult for these people to do things that resonate with the people of South Sudan. Lindbergh further argues that the importance of elections as a primary means through which the ruled, in this case, the people of South Sudan, select and establish a binding social contract. So there must be a contract between the governed and the people who are in power at that time. As we speak now in South Sudan, I don't think that social contract exists. Concept of a free and fair process. So basically, like I said earlier, it enhances credibility of any election. So you cannot talk of credibility without the process being free and fair. So election, as defined by Bush and Pruther, define election as credible when people trust its results and believe that it produces an outcome that reflects the will of the people. So if an election is held and people do not think it actually reflects their will, then it was not free, it was not fair. And of course, I have to remind us that an election is a process. It is not an event. So if on the voting day, people are able to vote freely, there's no coercion, there's nothing, and you think you've won because on that day, people voted in your favor, but then it could be people from certain constituencies were not registered to vote. So there was voter suppression. If there was voter suppression in a given region, of course, there would be few of them voting. And at the end of the day, people from certain regions or certain constituencies are going to vote more. But that does not mean that the person who has won that process, that election was actually genuinely won. And people are not going to feel that way, that actually the process was fair. So thus, credibility is built on people's perception of how free and fair the electoral process was, to the extent that the results are perceived as reflecting that will. And the opinions of the people are founded on their vote choice, with the winners perceiving an election as having been fair and credible, and the losers holding contrary opinion. So if you've lost in the process, obviously you will say, no, I lost because it was not free and fair. But then someone who won, despite knowing that the process was not free and fair, is going to say, the process was free and fair, and that's why I won. So it's basically relative. SHA perceives the legitimacy of elected leaders and government grounded on the voters' trust of the entire process, like I said earlier. And this is particularly so as the citizenry have broad experience of interacting with the entire electoral process. So if you are saying, like it was said earlier this year and last year, that there were going to be elections in South Sudan, you are saying that there are going to be elections. Yes, the people have to interact with the entire process, from the voter registration, from having a constitution that says that we're going to have elections, because it cannot be dictated one day, someone wakes up and say we're going to have elections. No, it must be enshrined in the law. The people must be aware that there's going to be an election, and they should be able to interact with the entire process. So SHA observes that though there is a consensus on free and fair elections as a primary measure of emerging and mature democracies, there's a lack of agreed indicators upon which that can be measured. So when do you say an election is free and fair? What are the measures to determine the fairness and credibility of that election? There's no agreement on which measures should actually, that must be there for you to say elections were free and fair. And that makes it difficult to measure that the fairness and credibility of an election. So attainment of free, fair, and credible elections therefore remains elusive, as indicators may be contextual because there's a lack of overtly agreed measurement tools. So an election that is free and fair in the United Kingdom may not be free and fair in South Sudan, for example, and vice versa. So it's basically huge. In other words, what is free, fair, and credible should take cognizance of unique and different realities, such as the democracy that is emerging from internal conflicts or electoral violence. In 2012, for example, in Kenya, having emerged from the 2007, 2008 election violence, elections were held. Of course, many Kenyans thought the process was fair, having emerged from an election that was violent. A similar thing may have happened in South Sudan in 2010, when elections were held, like I'll talk about later. Of course, many people who were not supporting SPLM at that time did not have an opportunity in the South. But then the SPLM believed that elections were free and fair in the South, while saying that the elections were not free and fair in the North, because there were some SPLM strongholds in the North, in the Nuba Mountains, that did not have an opportunity to vote, for example, in South Kordofan. Well, there are further arguments. So Bishop and Hoffler regards free and fair elections as democratic conduct characterized by the right to vote. So there must be a right to vote, registration of voters, freedom to vie for an elective position, not just to vote, but you should also have that freedom to be voted for. Freedom to conduct campaigns without intimidation, and access to media. These things were not there in the last few months before elections were cancelled in South Sudan. I'll show you some pictures of the SPLM candidate, presidential candidate, campaigning in different parts of South Sudan. But then, if you don't see any picture of an opposition candidate campaigning, don't be surprised, because there was none. So, and access to media, there was censorship in many media outlets in South Sudan, whether it's a radio, newspaper. There's no print media in South Sudan that releases a paper without being censored, without being read through by the national security in South Sudan. That means if there is an opposition candidate who is vying for elections, the agenda is not going to come out. that is already suppression. Even if they get into elections and elections are free on the day of voting, their would-be voters do not get to know about the agenda. And as a result, they may not turn up to vote, or they may not vote for them. So accuracy in vote counting, timely transmission of results, impartiality in the management of disputes are imperative in legitimizing elections. Gill conceptualizes free and fair elections as a concept. Free is about participation, choice, and choice. Free is about equality of participation and the vote and of the vote, and about impartiality and non-discrimination. Together, they imply respect for human rights at large and absence of coercion. So no one should be forced to go and vote or not to vote. But in all this, there must be frameworks upon which the entire process relies. And in this case, legal and institutional frameworks are very important. You cannot say you're going to have elections when you don't have a constitution. What happens in an event that elections, there is violence or there is dispute? Because elections should not only end upon declaration of results. Some parties that participate in an election may not be satisfied with the results. So they should have rights to go to the court and to dispute the elections. So, and that can only be established by institutions and certain legal frameworks, including the Constitution. So Euclid posits that the legal and institutional framework, the political context, and levelness of the electoral playing ground are important in assessing the equality of elections. This also implies that a meaningful assessment of a free and fair process should take consideration of all activities and relevant institutions as opposed to focusing on voting days. So, for this extension, there was an extension, I think in 2022, when the government was extended. And the reasons were that we are not ready for elections, we have not made the constitution yet, and we're going to do that in the next 2 years so that we can have an election in 2024. That did not happen. We do not have a new constitution that had been anticipated by the 2018 peace agreement, that we should have a new constitution that is going to guide us as a country and that's going to guide the electoral process. That was not possible. And it is again on the same grounds that elections were postponed this year. That we are not ready for elections. The constitution, of course, the SPLM and pro-government people were agitating for elections to take place because they wanted to legitimize themselves. Because if you are not elected, of course, people can always say, you're not elected, whom are you representing? So they wanted to organize something, even if it was shoddy, at least it would legitimize them, of course, at the expense of the South Sudanese people. That the government should not only create conditions that enable free, fair, and credible elections, but should also develop institutional capacity necessary for the practice of democratic politics. So, different political groups talked here today. Of course, the ideologies may differ, but then there should be an environment where people can talk freely. Can other people reach a consensus? Instead of censoring, saying this idea is bad. Of course, it may be bad, but then you should allow someone to express themselves. And that freedom of expression currently in South Sudan is not, I don't think it's there. It's, of course, arguably to me, I don't think it is there. And it's something that everyone should advocate for, whether you are pro-government, because you have seen some people who are pro-government being arrested after leaving the same government. But then they were advocating for suppression of opposition. Now they have become the opposition and are facing the same laws that they were advocating for. Earlier this year, there was the National Security Bill that was passed, and we know who actually agitated for that. A couple of weeks ago, that the same person is no longer in this position that he was advocating for that from, and of course may be a victim of the same thing. So we should make these laws keeping in mind that we're not making them against our enemies or for ourselves. They should be there for the people of South Sudan, because you never know the point that the same process may apply to you. So the context of South Sudan, of course, like I said earlier, we have never had elections in the state of South Sudan. So how is the country being ruled? if there are no legal representatives. This has been mainly through peace agreements, through decrees, the president appointing so and so even at the state level. And of course, that has disadvantages. If you are appointed by the president, your loyalty is not going to be to the people. It's going to be to the president. Well, so in the elections of 2010, the entirety of South Sudan voted SPLM. Of course, the credibility of those elections is a matter that other people can argue for. But there was one independent candidate who won governorship in South Sudan. That was Joseph Bangasi Bagosoro of Western Equatoria. And of course, when South Sudan became independent, there was an interim transition constitution that was formed, and it vested a lot of powers in the hands of the president. So this was Bagosoro immediately, I think about, oh, sorry, no, not the picture, sorry, the statement. Yeah, so South Sudan president says it can only dismiss elected governors if convicted of a crime. That was Bagosoro upon meeting the president. That was about this was about 8 days after the independence of South Sudan. That was his statement, because he was scared that since he was not SPLM, South Sudan is independent now, it may be dismissed. What happened? Taban Deng was dismissed 2 years later. He was an elected governor. Here has been reshuffling SPLM government officials in different cities. Was an example from Upper Nile State. We have here, yes. So we have officials in the government of Kir. This is Dr. Martin Elia Lomboro saying that we have not failed as a state. We are assigned by the Bible to lead our people. Again, Elia here asking the new finance minister to work for them. That is Michael McQuay there, talking about there's no lean government that will be set up. The parliament will remain in place. The presidency will be as it is with the 5 different vice presidents. The executive will remain as it is. And so, what is your information? He's the Minister of Information. And then, of course, there have been several extensions by the parliament. And then last year, the need for an election was advocated for by SPLM, and the president started campaigning. This was him. And then the irony here, in Upper Nile State, the president adjourns his endorsement rally that was supposed to take place in Malakal because of bad road network. There's been no other government in South Sudan other than the SPLM government. And the SPLM cannot go and campaign in parts of South Sudan because of bad road network. Carrying a wheel, telling other parties to unveil flag bearers. SPLM was here wooing their supporters in Ye ahead of Kir's endorsement. So actually many of the campaigns took place in Equatoria because the other parts of the country were not accessible, according to SPLM. These were supporters of SPLM rallying in Torit. And Torit in Eastern Equatoria is the only state in South Sudan where the elected governor has been there. So I don't know the association between the president, their relationship with Louis Lobong. But Louis Lobong is the only elected governor in the entirety of South Sudan who has maintained his position. Syria was pledging peaceful elections at the SPLM rally in Juba. And then, of course, the shocker came in September this year, where South Sudan presidency with different parties postponed the elections for 2 years. But the surprise here was that they postponed the election, but they didn't tell us what were they going to do in the 2 years. So you're saying we cannot hold the elections because we are not ready. But what are you going to do? What is going to be different in the 2 years? That was never said. And of course, I think someone was talking earlier today saying that they are soon going to tell us what they are going to do in the 2 years. So let's wait and see if it is going to materialize. Of course, it was criticized by the international community. And by international community, I mean Troika, which is consisting of the United Kingdom, the United States, and Norway. It's a major player here, it's a major stakeholder. And of course, many other agencies who funded the process. So they were disappointed, they are not supportive of the process. So I don't know how the government of South Sudan, with its parties, is going to single-handedly. Yeah. So thank you very much. That comes to the end of the process. And this is the map of South Sudan. Of course, I said earlier with Dr. Akim, there were some errors. So this is the right map of South Sudan. Of course, the proportionality of the map. Yeah. Yeah. No, but Jonkler is not only Bor. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel, for a presentation. And one could only wish that certain Western governments and politicians too had listened to it. I think I will ask the next speaker to come now and present, and then we will have at the end a few minutes left for a discussion.